Cop arrests 9-year-old girl, faces immediate consequences. The coffee maker gurgled its last drops as Tom Bradley adjusted his police belt, the familiar weight of his equipment settling against his hips. The morning sun hadn't fully risen yet, casting long shadows across his kitchen counter. He grabbed his cup, black and bitter just like his mood, and took a quick sip before heading out. The scalding liquid barely registered. He'd burned his taste buds years ago from this same morning routine. Before we can continue, if you love your family, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. His neighbor waved from across the street, but Tom only managed a curt nod. Mrs. Peterson used to bring him cookies when he first moved to the neighborhood 15 years ago, but those days were long gone. These days, most folks kept their distance, and that suited him just fine. He climbed into his patrol car, the leather seat creaking under his weight. The radio crackled to life as he started his shift. Unit 247, copy. Tom's voice came out gruff, matching the heavy weight settling in his chest. He'd been on edge since last week when a teenager had mouthed off during a routine traffic stop. The kid had gotten away with just a warning. His sergeant had insisted on it, and the memory still burned. The morning traffic moved like molasses, testing what little patience he had left. A red Honda cut across 2 lanes without signaling, and Tom's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. But he held back. Too much paperwork this early in the shift wasn't worth it. Instead, he turned down Oak Street, where the local shops were just opening their doors. Jimmy, the newsstand guy, ducked his head when he saw Tom's cruiser. Last month, Tom had given him a ticket for having his display too far out on the sidewalk. Rules exist for a reason, he'd said, ignoring Jimmy's explanation about needing more visibility for his struggling business. The ticket had been by the book, perfectly justified, but something about Jimmy's defeated expression had stuck with him. The car's radio buzzed again. A minor disturbance at the gas station on 5th, some kids playing their music too loud. Tom felt his jaw clench. Another day, another batch of people who couldn't follow simple rules. He'd been on the force for 22 years, and it seemed like things were getting worse. Nobody respected authority anymore. Nobody understood that order was what kept society from falling apart. He pulled into the gas station, lights off but presence enough to scatter the teenagers like pigeons. Their speakers cut mid-song, and they peeled out of the parking lot before he could even step out of his car. Tom watched them go, a mixture of satisfaction and frustration churning in his gut. They'd be back, they always came back, and next time he'd make sure to run their plates. The morning wore on, each minor incident adding another layer to his foul mood. A jaywalker here, an illegal parking there, small infractions that most of his colleagues would wave off, but Tom documented each one. His ticket book was filling up faster than usual, each citation a small victory in his personal war against chaos. By mid-morning, word had spread through his beat. Officer Bradley was on a tear. Shop owners quickly corrected their sandwich boards, dog walkers made sure they had their leashes and waste bags visible, and even the regular panhandlers found somewhere else to be. The streets were orderly, just as they should be, but the peace felt brittle, ready to snap at the slightest pressure. Tom stopped at Linda's diner for his usual mid-morning coffee. Linda herself was behind the counter, and he could see her shoulders tense as he walked in. The bell above the door chimed cheerfully, at odds with the sudden quiet that fell over the breakfast crowd. Last week, he'd written her up for having an expired permit displayed. The fact that she'd already submitted the renewal paperwork hadn't swayed him. The old permit was still visible, and that was a violation. The usual, Officer Bradley's? Linda's voice was professional, but the warmth that used to be there was gone. He nodded, not meeting her eyes. As she poured his coffee, he noticed a new permit properly displayed on the wall. The sight should have pleased him, but somehow it didn't. Back in his car, Tom flipped through his morning reports. 5 citations before noon, a new record. His sergeant would probably call him in for another talk about community relations and discretionary enforcement. The last conversation had ended with Tom walking out, arguing that selective enforcement was just another word for favoritism. He remembered when he'd first joined the force, fresh-faced and idealistic. His training officer, Mike Sullivan, had tried to teach him about balance. "The law's important, Tommy, Mike had said, but so are the people we serve. Tom had nodded back then, but somewhere along the line, he'd convinced himself that serving the law was the same as serving the people. These days, Mike barely spoke to him at department meetings. The radio crackled again, a noise complaint from the park. Tom felt a familiar surge of purpose as he pulled away from the curb. The park had been a source of constant irritation lately. New maintenance work meant new restrictions, but people kept ignoring the signs. He'd already handed out several warnings this week, but maybe it was time to show that he meant business. As he drove, Tom caught his reflection in the rearview mirror. The stern face looking back at him had deep lines around the mouth, and his close-cropped hair was more gray than brown now. When had that happened? He remembered his father, also a cop, looking exactly like this, all straight edges and hard angles. His mother used to say his father carried the weight of his badge like a shield, keeping the world at arm's length. The park came into view, its green expanse dotted with the usual morning crowd. Dog walkers, joggers, kids heading to the playground, all potential rule breakers in Tom's eyes. He parked where he could see the main entrance, his trained gaze already scanning for violations. The new maintenance area was clearly marked with yellow tape and no trespassing signs, but experience told him it was only a matter of time before someone decided the rules didn't apply to them. A group of children caught his attention, their laughter carrying across the park. They were playing some kind of game, running between the trees and benches. Tom watched them closely, his fingers drumming against the steering wheel. One of them, a little girl in a bright yellow dress, was getting awfully close to the restricted area. He could feel the familiar tension building in his shoulders, that mix of anticipation and irritation that had become his constant companion. The morning sun had risen fully now, casting harsh shadows across the park. Tom checked his watch, not even noon, and he could feel a headache building behind his eyes. But he had a job to do, a purpose to fulfill. Someone had to maintain order in a world that seemed increasingly chaotic. If that made him unpopular, if it meant people crossed the street when they saw him coming, well, that was the price of doing things right. The children's game was getting more animated, their movements more erratic. Tom reached for his door handle, ready to intervene at the first sign of trouble. He didn't enjoy confronting kids, contrary to what some people thought, but rules were rules, and age wasn't an excuse for breaking them. Besides, better they learn now than later, when the consequences would be more severe. A cool breeze carried the sound of more laughter across the park, but Tom wasn't smiling. He couldn't remember the last time he had genuinely smiled on duty. Maybe that should have bothered him more than it did. Tom stepped out of his patrol car, his boots crunching against the gravel path. The kids' laughter grew louder as he approached, though none of them had noticed him yet. They were lost in their own world, playing some made-up game that involved a lot of running and shouting. 5 children in total, probably all from the nearby elementary school, judging by their backpacks tossed carelessly near a bench. The girl in the yellow dress, he'd learn later her name was Lily, moved like a tiny whirlwind, her dark braids bouncing as she ducked and weaved between her friends. She was clearly the ringleader, calling out invented rules and giggling when the others protested. Tom watched her dart around a tree, her sneakers leaving scuff marks on the pathway. Another minor violation he might normally address, but he had bigger concerns. The maintenance area ahead had been cordoned off for 3 days now. The Parks Department was fixing a broken water main, leaving a sizable hole in the ground. They'd put up the usual yellow tape and signs, but Tom had argued for more substantial barriers. Nobody had listened. Now he stood watching these kids playing closer and closer to the restricted zone, his earlier frustration bubbling up again. A boy in a red t-shirt tagged Lily's shoulder, sending her spinning away from the group. "Can't catch me now," she shouted, her voice carrying across the park. Several morning joggers smiled as they passed by, clearly finding the children's game charming. Tom felt his jaw tighten. Nobody else seemed to notice how close they were getting to the restricted area, or maybe they just didn't care. The wind picked up, rattling the yellow caution tape. One of the no trespassing signs had come loose, tilting at an angle that made it harder to read. Tom made a mental note to report that to the Parks Department, though he doubted they'd fix it quickly. Nobody took pride in their work anymore, not like they used to. Lily's game was reaching a crescendo. She'd managed to evade all her friends, who were now working together to corner her. Tom could see what was about to happen before it did. The girl was backing up, paying attention only to her pursuers, completely unaware of where she was going. Her heel touched the tilted sign, and she stumbled slightly. Time seemed to slow down as Tom watched her step backward, right past the caution tape. It wasn't a dramatic breach, just a single step, really, but in Tom's mind, it might as well have been a full-scale invasion. The other kids froze, finally noticing his presence, their faces shifting from excitement to uncertainty in an instant. The park had gone oddly quiet. Even the birds seemed to sense the shifting mood. A young mother pulled her toddler closer as she hurried past, picking up on the tension in the air. Tom straightened his uniform shirt, his badge catching the sunlight. This was the moment to act, to show these kids that rules existed for a reason. His boots felt heavy as he crossed the remaining distance. The children bunched together instinctively, all except Lily, who was still standing just inside the restricted area. She'd finally noticed him, but instead of jumping back immediately, she just stood there, head tilted slightly, curious rather than afraid. That somehow made it worse. "Young lady," Tom called out, his voice carrying the weight of 22 years of authority. "Step away from that area immediately." He could have started with a gentler approach, maybe even made a joke about it, like some of his colleagues might have done. But those officers didn't understand. Give an inch, and people would take a mile. Lily blinked at him, suddenly realizing her position. She looked down at her feet, then at the caution tape behind her, and her eyes widened. A small "oh" escaped her lips as she quickly stepped forward, back onto the proper path. But it was too late. The rule had already been broken, the line already crossed. Other park visitors were slowing down now, some stopping entirely to watch the scene unfold. Tom could feel their eyes on him, judging, waiting to see what he would do. He'd dealt with this kind of scrutiny before. Let them watch. Maybe they'd learn something about respect for law and order. "Do you know how to read?" Tom asked, pointing at the tilted sign. His voice came out harder than he'd intended, but he pressed on. "What does that sign say?" The other children had started to inch away, but Lily stood her ground, her yellow dress bright against the gray morning. "It says no trespassing," she answered, her voice small but clear. She twisted the hem of her dress between her fingers, a nervous habit that reminded Tom of his niece. He pushed that thought away. "I didn't mean to go there," she added quickly. "We were just playing tag." A jogger had stopped nearby, pretending to stretch while obviously listening. Two women walking their dogs slowed their pace, exchanging glances. Tom could practically hear what they were thinking. Here goes Officer Bradley again, making a big deal out of nothing. But they didn't understand. This wasn't about one little girl stepping over a line. This was about all the lines that people crossed every day, thinking the rules didn't apply to them. "Just playing tag," Tom repeated, letting the words hang in the air. "And I suppose you think that makes it okay to ignore clearly posted signs? To put yourself in danger." He gestured at the construction area behind the tape. "There's a reason this area is restricted. There's a large hole back there that could seriously hurt someone." Lily's friends had retreated to the nearby bench, where their backpacks lay scattered. They whispered among themselves, throwing worried glances at the scene. One of them, a slightly older girl, looked like she wanted to say something but couldn't find the courage. "I'm sorry," Lily said, and Tom could see tears starting to form in her eyes. "I didn't see the sign until you said something. I was just trying not to get tagged." Her explanation was perfectly reasonable, the kind of thing that would make most people smile and wave it off. But Tom had seen too many people use excuses like this, had watched too many small infractions turn into bigger problems. The morning had grown warmer, but Tom felt cold inside. He'd come to work today already wound tight, and now here was this child, this clear violation of posted rules, this gathering audience of disapproving faces. Something had to give. "Name and address," he said, pulling out his notebook. The jogger who'd been stretching suddenly stood up straight, disbelief clear on his face. Lily's lower lip trembled as she recited her name and street number, her voice catching slightly on the words. "Lily Anderson," she managed, then gave an address just a few blocks away. "Please, I won't do it again. I promise." Her friends had gone completely silent now, watching with wide eyes as Tom wrote in his notebook. He could hear more whispers from the growing crowd of onlookers, could feel the weight of their judgment. A light breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the sound of normal park activities from further away. A dog barking, children playing on the swings, someone's radio playing soft music. But here, in this moment, everything felt suspended, waiting on what Officer Tom Bradley would do next. He looked at the girl standing before him, at her trembling hands and tear-filled eyes, at the yellow dress that suddenly seemed too bright for this gray morning. He thought about all the times he'd given warnings that were ignored, all the small rules broken that led to bigger problems. He thought about his father, about carrying the badge's weight, about maintaining order in a world that seemed to care less and less about following rules. The decision crystallized in his mind, hard and sharp as broken glass. Sometimes, he told himself, people needed to learn the hard way. Sometimes, a lesson had to hurt to be remembered. He reached for his handcuffs, the metal cold against his palm. The park had gone completely silent now, as if holding its breath. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. Lily's eyes fixed on the handcuffs, and something in her expression shifted from nervousness to real fear. But Tom had already crossed his own line, had already convinced himself that this was necessary, that this was right. He took a step forward, the handcuffs catching the morning light. In that moment, he was no longer just Officer Bradley. He was every rule that had ever been broken, every warning that had ever been ignored, every bit of order he'd tried to maintain in an increasingly chaotic world. And Lily, in her yellow dress with tears in her eyes, was no longer just a 9-year-old girl who'd stepped over a line by accident. She was everything he needed to prove a point about. The click of the handcuffs opening echoed in the still air. Lily's eyes darted between Tom's face and the metal in his hands, her small frame starting to shake. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a small squeak came out, like a mouse caught in a trap. Her friends had abandoned any pretense of whispers now, their gasps cutting through the morning silence. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," Tom commanded, his voice steady despite the tremor in his gut. He'd done this hundreds of times before, but never to someone so small. The handcuffs seemed massive compared to Lily's wrists, and somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice was screaming at him to stop. "Please," Lily managed to whisper, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "I don't want to go to jail." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she looked around desperately for help, her yellow dress fluttering in the breeze like a broken butterfly wing. Tom's hand tightened around the handcuffs. "This isn't a debate, young lady. You've committed a crime by trespassing in a restricted area and endangering yourself. Actions have consequences." The words felt rehearsed, hollow, but he pushed on. "Now turn around." The first person to speak up was one of Lily's friends, the older girl who had been hesitating earlier. She didn't do anything wrong. Her voice wavered, but grew stronger as she continued. "We were just playing. You can't arrest her." "Stay out of this," Tom snapped, but the girl's outburst had broken some invisible barrier. More voices joined in, first as murmurs, then as clear objections. The jogger who had been watching stepped closer, his face flushed with more than just exercise. Lily, caught in the middle of this growing storm, began to sob in earnest. Her shoulders shook as she tried to explain between hiccups. "I didn't see. I was just... Please don't." Each broken phrase felt like a hammer hitting Tom's resolve, but he'd gone too far to back down now. He reached for her shoulder, turning her around with what he told himself was gentle pressure. Her friends scrambled off the bench, one of them running toward the playground where parents were starting to notice the commotion. Lily's hands were cold and trembling as he brought them behind her back. The first cuff closed around her tiny wrist with a sound that seemed to cut through the park like a gunshot. Someone in the growing crowd shouted, "Are you insane?" Another voice called out, "She's just a kid." Tom tried to block them out, focusing on the procedure, on the familiar motions that usually brought order to chaos. But this was different. This wasn't a drunk driver or a shoplifter. This was a 9-year-old girl in a yellow dress, crying so hard she could barely breathe, her wrists so small the cuffs had to be closed to their tightest setting. Tom could feel sweat running down his back despite the cool morning air. A woman pushed through the crowd, her face twisted with anger and disbelief. "I see this girl here every week," she called out, her voice carrying across the park. "She helps younger kids on the swings. She picks up trash when she sees it. What are you thinking?" Tom's mouth was dry as he recited, "Ma'am, please step back. This is a police matter." The words sounded ridiculous even to his own ears, but he pressed on. "This area is clearly marked as restricted. The sign states dash." The sign, someone interrupted. "She's 9 years old. She was playing tag." More voices joined in, a chorus of protest that seemed to come from every direction. Phones appeared in people's hands, their cameras pointing at the scene like accusing eyes. Lily's sobs had turned into quiet whimpers, her small body shaking with each breath. The handcuffs gleamed in the morning sun, a stark metal contrast against her yellow dress. Tom could feel the situation spiraling out of control, but something in him refused to acknowledge the growing horror of what he was doing. "Step back, all of you," he ordered, his voice rising to carry over the crowd's protests. "This is official police business. Interfering with an arrest is a criminal offense." The threat hung in the air, but instead of cowering, the crowd grew more agitated. A man in a business suit stepped forward, his tie fluttering in the breeze. "I'm a lawyer," he announced, phone already in hand. "And what you're doing is a gross abuse of power. That child has committed no crime that would warrant arrest under any reasonable interpretation of the law." Tom's collar felt too tight, his uniform suddenly heavy and constraining. "Sir, I've warned you about interfering dash," he started, but the lawyer cut him off.
"No, officer.
You need to listen now." That girl stepped 1 foot past a warning sign while playing tag. She immediately complied when told to move. There is no justification for this arrest, and you know it. More phones were recording now. Someone in the crowd was live-streaming, narrating the scene with barely contained fury. "This is happening right now at Central Park. An officer is handcuffing a little girl for playing tag. This is what our police have become." Lily's friends had found their voices again, their initial shock turning to outrage. They crowded closer, despite Tom's warnings to stay back. "Let her go," they shouted. "She didn't do anything wrong." Their young voices carried across the park, drawing more attention, more witnesses to Tom's unraveling authority. A mother pushing a stroller stopped at the edge of the crowd, her face paling as she took in the scene. "Oh my God," she whispered, loud enough for Tom to hear. "What is wrong with him?" Her words cut deeper than the angry shouts, carrying a weight of judgment that made Tom's stomach turn. Lily tried to turn her head to look at him, her face streaked with tears. "My mom," she hiccuped between sobs. "Can someone call my mom, please?" The simple request, so childlike in its fear and hope, sent a ripple through the crowd. Several people immediately reached for their phones, as if they all knew her mother personally. The lawyer had moved closer, his phone still recording. "Officer, I'm going to say this one more time. Release that child immediately, or, I promise you, by this afternoon, every news station in the city will be running this story. Your badge number is clearly visible in these recordings." Tom's radio crackled to life, making him jump. The dispatcher's voice came through, asking for a status update. He'd been so focused on Lily and the crowd that he hadn't noticed how much time had passed. His hand moved to key the radio, but what could he say? Officer Bradley responding to a child trespassing by arresting her? The moment stretched out, filled with the sound of Lily's quiet crying, the murmur of the crowd, and the click of phone cameras. Tom could feel his carefully constructed world of rules and order crumbling around him. Every second the handcuffs stayed on Lily's wrists was another nail in the coffin of his career, his reputation, his belief in his own righteousness. Someone in the crowd had started calling the police station directly, their voice carrying across the park as they described the scene to whoever was on the other end. "Officer Bradley has handcuffed a little girl." "Yes," I said, "handcuffed. She was playing tag." "No, I'm not joking." The morning had turned surreal, like a nightmare Tom couldn't wake up from. The sun continued to shine, birds still sang in the trees, and somewhere in the distance, life went on normally. But here, in this moment, everything had changed. The line he'd crossed wasn't just a yellow tape marking a restricted area. It was a boundary between reason and obsession, between authority and abuse. Lily's yellow dress fluttered in the breeze, a bright splash of color against the gray backdrop of Tom's collapsing world. Her small hands, bound behind her back, had stopped shaking, as if she'd moved beyond fear into something else entirely. The crowd's anger had taken on a new tone, less shocked and more determined, as if they'd collectively decided that this couldn't be allowed to continue. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the tension, growing louder with each passing second. Tom knew what it meant. Someone higher up had heard about what was happening. Soon, he would have to explain himself, to justify actions that were becoming more inexplicable with each passing moment. The weight of his badge, once a source of pride, now felt like it was dragging him down into depths he never meant to explore. The sirens grew louder, their wail mixing with the angry voices of the crowd. People were no longer just watching, they were organizing, sharing videos, calling news stations. A young woman in running gear was reading out comments from her live stream. It's already got 1,000 shares. Everyone's asking where this is. Channel 5 just messaged me. The lawyer had positioned himself between Tom and Lily, his phone still recording. "The world is watching now, Officer Bradley," he said, his voice steady but charged with anger. "Every second those cuffs stay on her wrists is another second this goes viral. Another second your career circles the drain." Lily had gone quiet, her sobs reduced to shallow breathing. The yellow dress that had started the morning so bright now hung limp and wrinkled, darkened with tears. Her friends huddled nearby, no longer shouting but watching with wide, disbelieving eyes that made Tom's chest tight. A police cruiser pulled up to the park entrance, lights flashing but siren now silent. Officer Sarah Martinez stepped out, taking in the scene with a quick, professional glance. Tom knew her. They'd worked the same beat for 3 years. He'd never seen the expression she wore now, a mix of horror and disappointment that made him want to look away. "Tom," she called out, walking quickly toward the group. "What the hell are you doing?" She didn't wait for an answer, her eyes fixed on Lily's small frame. The crowd parted for her, dozens of phones tracking her movement. The mother who had spoken up earlier stepped forward. "Officer, I've been here since it started. This man," she pointed at Tom, her hand shaking with anger, "arrested this little girl for accidentally stepping over a line while playing tag. She's been handcuffed for at least 10 minutes now." Sarah's face hardened as she reached them. "Tom, give me your keys," she said quietly, her hand extended. When he didn't move, she added more firmly, "Now." The keys felt heavy as he pulled them from his belt, the metal warm from being pressed against his hip. The crowd had gone oddly quiet, watching the exchange between the officers. Someone whispered, "About time," but most people just held their phones steady, documenting every moment. The lawyer stepped back slightly, giving Sarah room to work, but kept his camera focused on the scene. Sarah knelt beside Lily, her voice gentle. "Hey, sweetheart, I'm Officer Martinez. I'm going to take these off, okay?" She spoke as if they were the only 2 people in the park, as if the crowd and cameras and Tom himself had disappeared. Lily nodded, her braids bobbing with the movement. The sound of the handcuffs opening seemed to release something in the crowd. A collective exhale, followed by a new wave of angry murmurs. Someone shouted, "He should be the one in cuffs." Others joined in, their voices rising with renewed outrage now that Lily was being freed. Lily's friends rushed forward as soon as the cuffs were off, surrounding her like a protective wall. The older girl who had spoken up first wrapped her arms around Lily's shoulders, glaring at Tom with an intensity that made him step back. These weren't just kids anymore. They were witnesses to something that would haunt them, shape their view of authority for years to come. Sarah helped Lily rotate her shoulders, checking her wrists for marks. The cuffs had been tight enough to leave faint red lines on her skin, each one a damning piece of evidence in the court of public opinion. Someone in the crowd took a close-up photo, the camera's click sounding like another nail in Tom's coffin. "Has anyone reached her parents?" Sarah asked, still focused on Lily. Multiple voices responded at once. "Yes, they were on their way. They'd been called multiple times. They should be here any minute." The crowd had become a community, united in their concern for the girl and their anger at Tom. The lawyer stepped forward again, his phone finally lowered. "Officer Martinez, I want to formally file a complaint against Officer Bradley. I have video evidence of the entire incident, including his refusal to release her when multiple citizens pointed out the obvious abuse of power." Tom opened his mouth to defend himself, but Sarah cut him off with a sharp look. "Not now, Tom," she said, her voice hard. "Not one word." She turned back to the lawyer, her tone professional again. "Sir, I'll take your information, and I assure you this incident will be thoroughly investigated." More police cars were arriving now, parking along the street. Officers Tom had worked with for years stepped out, their faces a mix of confusion and dismay as they took in the scene. The crowd's phones swiveled to capture their arrival, dozens of recordings capturing every angle of Tom's humiliation. A woman's voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. "Lily. Oh my God, Lily." A woman in medical scrubs pushed through the gathered people, her face pale with panic. Lily broke away from her friends, running toward her mother with a cry that seemed to carry all the fear and pain of the past 20 minutes.
Mom.
Lily collapsed into her mother's arms, fresh tears starting. The woman held her daughter tight, looking over her head at the officers with a mixture of fury and disbelief. Her scrubs indicated she'd come straight from work, probably running the whole way. "What happened to my daughter?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "Who put handcuffs on my 9-year-old child?" The crowd answered before any officer could speak, multiple voices explaining the situation, showing her videos, pointing at Tom. With each new detail, her face grew darker. Sarah stepped forward, her badge catching the sunlight. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Martinez. I've removed the handcuffs and checked your daughter for any marks. Would you like medical attention?" The professional courtesy seemed to steady Lily's mother slightly, but her arms stayed tight around her daughter. "I want his badge number," she said, nodding toward Tom. "I want his supervisor's name. I want every single video of what happened here." The lawyer immediately moved to her side, offering his card, promising to share his recording. Others in the crowd called out that they'd email their videos, that they'd be witnesses, that they'd support any action she wanted to take. Tom stood frozen, watching his career unravel in real time. The morning sun felt too bright now, exposing every poor decision, every moment of inflexibility that had led to this point. His radio crackled again, dispatch asking for an update, but Sarah reached over and turned it off before he could respond. The news vans were starting to arrive, their satellite dishes visible above the park's trees. Reporters jumped out, cameras already rolling, moving toward the crowd with practiced efficiency. Tom could see his face on dozens of phone screens as people watched their own recordings, sharing them on social media, sending them to news outlets. "Officer Bradley," Sarah said quietly, standing close enough that only he could hear. "You need to leave.
Now."
The captain is on his way, and believe me, you don't want to be here when he arrives." She pressed his keys back into his hand, adding, "Go straight to the station. Don't talk to anyone. Don't try to explain. Just go." As Tom turned to leave, he heard Lily's voice one last time. "Mom," she was saying, her words muffled against her mother's scrubs, "I was just playing tag. I didn't mean to break any rules." The simple truth of her statement hit him harder than any angry shout from the crowd. The walk to his cruiser felt endless. People moved away as he passed, their phones following his retreat, their faces showing emotions ranging from disgust to pity. The careful walls of authority he'd built around himself had crumbled, leaving him exposed and alone. The park that had started the morning as his domain now felt foreign and hostile. The trees that had provided shade now seemed to loom over him accusingly. Even the wind had turned, carrying the sound of angry voices and news reports to follow him as he walked away. The weight of his badge, once a source of pride, now felt like a burden too heavy to bear. The police station's parking lot was already filling with news vans when Tom pulled in. He parked in his usual spot, the familiar motion feeling somehow wrong, like he was playing at being a police officer rather than actually being one. As he cut the engine, his phone buzzed again. The screen showed 15 missed calls and more messages than he could count. The walk to the station's front door had never felt longer. Officers entering and exiting the building avoided his eyes, some actively changing direction to avoid crossing his path. Through the glass doors, he could see people gathered around desk computers, probably watching the videos that were now spreading across every social media platform. Bradley. Captain Richards' voice boomed across the lobby the moment Tom stepped inside. My office.
Now?
The captain stood in his doorway, his face set in stone, reading glasses dangling from his neck like they always did when something serious was happening. Tom felt dozens of eyes on him as he crossed the lobby. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, chairs swiveled to track his movement, and the usual busy noise of the station died down to a heavy silence. Even Angela at the front desk, who brought cookies every Friday and had a kind word for everyone, turned away when he passed. The captain's office smelled like coffee and old paperwork, just like always, but today it felt more like a principal's office than a place of authority. Captain Richards closed the door behind them with a soft click that somehow sounded final, like a judge's gavel falling. Sit, the captain ordered, pointing to one of the chairs facing his desk. As Tom sank into the familiar leather seat, Richards didn't move to his own chair but remained standing, looming over him. I've just watched a 9-year-old girl in handcuffs go viral. Want to explain that to me? Before Tom could answer, the captain held up his hand. No, wait. First, I want you to watch something. He turned his computer monitor around, showing a compilation of videos from the park. Different angles, different phones, but all showing the same thing. Tom putting handcuffs on a crying girl in a yellow dress. The footage was worse than he'd imagined. From the outside, he looked like a towering figure of senseless authority, rigid and cold as he ignored the child's tears and the crowd's protests. The camera angles caught every tremor in Lily's small frame, every tear that fell on her dress, every moment he chose to continue rather than stop. The girl's mother is a nurse at City General, Richards said when the videos ended, his voice dangerously quiet. She was in the middle of a shift when she got the call that her daughter was being arrested for playing tag. Do you understand what's happening here, Bradley? Do you grasp the magnitude of what you've done? Tom opened his mouth to explain about rules and authority, about maintaining order, but the words died in his throat. In the harsh fluorescent light of the captain's office, watching himself on video, every justification he'd built up seemed to crumble. We're trending nationally, Richards continued, turning his iPad around to show various social media feeds. Local news has already run 3 different segments. The mayor's office has called twice. And those videos, he gestured at his computer, they've been shared hundreds of thousands of times in the last hour. The captain finally sat down, the leather of his chair creaking under his weight. He pulled off his reading glasses and rubbed his eyes, suddenly looking older than his years. You know what the worst part is, Tom? This isn't even surprising to some people. They're using your name in hashtags, but not because they had to look it up. The community knows you. Of course it was Bradley, they're saying. He's been a problem for years. A knock at the door interrupted them. Officer Martinez entered without waiting for a response, her face grim. Captain, the girl's mother is here with her lawyer. And there are more reporters outside. Channel 7 is running it as their top story. Richards nodded. Stay, Sarah. You were first on scene, I want your perspective. He turned back to Tom. The lawyer, who was there, James Morton? He's one of the city's top civil rights attorneys. He's already filed a formal complaint and is talking about a lawsuit. Sarah stepped forward, her uniform crisp and professional in stark contrast to Tom's now rumpled appearance. Sir, when I arrived, the situation was already out of control. Officer Bradley had kept the child in handcuffs despite multiple witnesses pointing out the excessive nature of his response. The marks on her wrists were visible. The words hit Tom like physical blows. He'd worked with Sarah for years, had backed her up on countless calls. Now she was reporting his actions in the same professional tone she used for criminal complaints. The mother wants her badge, Richard said, opening a folder on his desk. And frankly, I'm having a hard time disagreeing with her. 22 years on the force, Tom. 22 years of complaints about excessive enforcement, rigid interpretation of minor violations, escalating simple situations into confrontations. But this... He tapped the screen where the video was paused on Lily's tears. "This is different. I was following protocol," Tom managed to say, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. The area was clearly marked as restricted. The signs were visible. Sarah made a sound that might have been a laugh if it hadn't been so sad. "She was playing tag, Tom. She stepped back 1 foot over a line while playing tag. And you put her in handcuffs? What protocol are you talking about?" The captain held up another paper. "The department's response is being drafted now. You're suspended, effective immediately. Badge and gun on my desk." When Tom didn't move immediately, Richard's voice hardened. Now, Bradley. The weight of his badge had been a constant presence for over 2 decades. Now, as Tom unclipped it from his uniform, it felt like he was removing a piece of himself. His hands shook slightly as he placed it on the captain's desk, followed by his service weapon. "The internal investigation will take several weeks," Richards continued, his tone formal now. "During that time, you are not to contact any witnesses, including the child or her family. You are not to make any public statements. You are not to return to that park or attempt to justify your actions to anyone. Do you understand?" Outside the office, phones were still ringing. Tom could hear snippets of conversations about press releases and official statements. The department's public affairs officer hurried past the door, already talking about damage control and community relations. "One more thing," Richards added as Tom stood to leave. "Those kids in the park? The ones who watched you arrest their friend? That's the kind of thing that stays with someone. That shapes how they see police officers for the rest of their lives. Every one of those children will remember today. Every parent who sees that video will think about it when they send their kids to play. That's your legacy now, Tom." The walk back through the station was a gauntlet of turned backs and whispered comments. Officers who had smiled and joked with him that morning now found urgent paperwork to examine as he passed. The weight of his missing badge felt like a physical void, throwing off his balance with every step. At the front desk, Angela was on the phone, but her voice carried clearly. "No, ma'am. Officer Bradley is not available for comment. The department is taking this incident very seriously." She didn't look up as Tom passed, her usual warm smile notably absent. The afternoon sun hit Tom's face as he pushed through the station doors, temporarily blinding him. Camera flashes immediately followed, accompanied by shouted questions from the reporters who had stationed themselves outside. "Officer Bradley, do you want to comment on the arrest? What made you decide to handcuff a child? Are you going to apologize?" He pushed through them without responding, their questions following him across the parking lot. His car, stripped of its official status, felt like a stranger's vehicle. As he slid behind the wheel, a final question cut through the noise. "Officer Bradley, what were you thinking?" The truth was he didn't know anymore. The certainty that had driven his actions in the park had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow feeling that no amount of rules or regulations could fill. Tom's house felt different when he pulled into the driveway. The familiar red brick and white trim looked unchanged, but something felt off, as if he was seeing it through a stranger's eyes. His neighbor's curtains twitched as he got out of his car, Mrs. Peterson probably already aware of what had happened. News traveled fast in small communities, and viral videos traveled even faster. The key fumbled in his lock, his hands still not quite steady. Inside, the silence hit him like a physical force. No radio chatter, no weight of the badge on his chest, no gun at his hip. He'd come home early from shifts before, but never like this, never stripped of the identity he'd worn for over 2 decades. His phone buzzed again, his sister this time. The same sister whose daughter had flashed through his mind when he'd seen Lily twist the hem of her dress. He let it go to voicemail, not ready to hear the disappointment in her voice. The message notification joined dozens of others, forming a digital chorus of judgment he couldn't bear to face. The living room wall held his commendations, certificates, and photos from his academy graduation. Young Tom Bradley smiled out from those frames, fresh-faced and idealistic, believing he could make the world better through order and discipline. He stared at that younger version of himself, trying to bridge the gap between then and now. His uniform felt suffocating. Tom stripped it off piece by piece, each item carrying the weight of the morning's events. The shirt still smelled like the park, grass, morning air, and something else, maybe fear. Lily's fear. He stuffed it into the laundry basket with more force than necessary. The TV turned on automatically when he sat in his recliner, a habit so ingrained he hadn't even thought about it. The local news was already running the story. Breaking news: local officer arrests 9-year-old girl for playing tag. The footage was everywhere, shot from multiple angles, each one showing him in a worse light than the last. Sources say Officer Thomas Bradley has a history of strict enforcement, the reporter was saying, standing in front of the park. Behind her, yellow police tape still marked the restricted area. That stupid piece of plastic that had seemed so important just hours ago. Community members have come forward with stories of previous incidents. He changed the channel, but the story followed him. Another station was interviewing witnesses from the park. The mother with the stroller was speaking now, her face still showing the shock and disgust he'd seen earlier. He wouldn't listen to reason. That poor little girl was terrified, and he just kept going.
Click.
A panel of experts discussing police overreach and community relations.
Click.
Social media reactions scrolling across the screen, each comment more damning than the last.
Click.
Lily's yellow dress, bright against the gray morning, her small wrists bound behind her back. Tom turned off the TV, but the images stayed with him. He could still hear her voice, the tremor in it as she asked someone to call her mother. The way her friends had clustered around her afterward, like they were protecting her from him. Him, the police officer who was supposed to be protecting them. The silence in his house grew heavier. From somewhere in the kitchen, he could hear the tick of the clock his mother had given him when he made sergeant. Each second seemed to echo, marking time in a life suddenly devoid of purpose. Without his badge, without his routine, who was he? His eyes fell on a photo he kept on the side table, him and his father in their uniforms, taken just before the old man retired. They stood straight-backed and proud, defenders of law and order. What would his father say now? The man who'd taught him that rules existed for a reason, that authority had to be maintained at all costs. Would he understand what had happened in the park? A car door slammed outside, and Tom jumped. He moved to the window, careful to stay behind the curtain. His partner, Mike Sullivan, was walking up the driveway. Mike, who'd tried to teach him about flexibility, about seeing the person before the violation. Mike, who'd stopped partnering with him years ago because their approaches had become too different. Tom watched Mike reach for the doorbell, then hesitate. After a moment, his old friend turned and walked back to his car, shaking his head. The rejection stung more than Tom expected. Even Mike, who'd known him longest on the force, couldn't find words for this situation. His phone buzzed again, this time with a text from his sister. She's the same age as Emma. How could you? The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Emma, his niece, who loved yellow dresses and playing tag. Emma, who looked up to her Uncle Tom, the police officer. What would she think when she saw the videos? The afternoon light slanted through his windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Tom found himself in the kitchen, staring at the coffee maker without seeing it. How many mornings had he started here, certain of his path, confident in his interpretation of right and wrong? The machine looked the same, but like everything else, it felt foreign now. He opened his laptop, knowing he shouldn't, but unable to stop himself. His name was trending on social media. People were sharing stories about him. The time he'd ticketed an elderly man for sitting too long on a park bench, the teenager he'd threatened to arrest for skateboarding in an empty parking lot, the countless minor violations he'd turned into confrontations. Each incident had seemed justified at the time. Rules were rules, after all. But seeing them collected like this, seeing the pattern through others' eyes, something began to crack in Tom's carefully constructed worldview. Had he always been this person? This rigid, uncompromising figure who could put handcuffs on a crying child? The lawyer's words echoed in his head. Every second those cuffs stay on her wrists is another second this goes viral. He'd been right. The videos were everywhere now. Some had added sad music, others showed Lily's face in slow motion as the cuffs went on. One clip focused on her friends' faces, their shock and fear as they watched authority become something frightening. Tom's hands shook as he closed the laptop. He'd spent his career believing in the absolute nature of rules, in the importance of maintaining order. But what order had he created in that park? What lesson had those children really learned? The sun was setting now, painting his living room walls with orange light. 24 hours ago, he'd been preparing for another shift, certain of his place in the world. Now that certainty was gone, replaced by questions he'd never allowed himself to ask. His phone kept buzzing, calls, texts, emails. The world wanted answers from Officer Bradley, explanations for actions that were becoming inexplicable even to himself. But Tom wasn't Officer Bradley anymore. The badge that had defined him for so long sat on the captain's desk, and the man left behind was a stranger to himself. A dog barked outside, and Tom remembered how the park had gone quiet when he'd approached the children. How many times had that happened over the years? How many times had his presence turned laughter into fear, play into panic? He'd told himself it was respect he was seeing, but now, the memory of Lily's mother's face flashed through his mind. The horror when she saw the marks on her daughter's wrists, the protective way she'd held her child. He'd done that. Not some nameless authority figure, not some faceless bureaucrat enforcing rules. Him. Tom Bradley had looked at a little girl playing tag and seen a criminal to be handcuffed. The realization hit him with physical force, driving him back into his chair. The rules hadn't made him do it. The badge hadn't made him do it. He had chosen moment by moment to escalate a child's game into a traumatic arrest. Each step had been his decision, each refusal to back down his choice. As night fell outside his window, Tom sat in his darkening house, the weight of his actions settling around him like a heavy blanket. The certainty he'd worn like armor for 22 years had cracked, revealing something he'd avoided seeing for far too long. The cost of rigid authority, the damage done in the name of absolute order. The clock in the kitchen kept ticking, counting seconds in a life that would never be the same. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more consequences, more painful realizations. But for now, Tom Bradley sat alone in the dark, finally beginning to see himself through the eyes of a frightened child in a yellow dress. The department hearing room felt massive, though Tom knew it was the same size it had always been. He sat alone at the table, his civilian clothes feeling wrong after so many years in uniform. The committee members filed in 5 senior officers and 2 civilian oversight representatives. Captain Richards sat in the center, his face unreadable. "Officer Bradley," Richards began, then corrected himself. "Mr. Bradley, we've reviewed all the evidence, including witness statements, video footage, and your service record. Before we make our final decision, do you have anything to say?" Tom had rehearsed this moment for days, but the words still stuck in his throat. "I was wrong." He finally managed, his voice rough. "Not just about that day in the park. About everything. The way I've been doing this job, the way I've treated people. I've been wrong for a long time." The admission hung in the air. Someone shifted in their chair. Papers rustled, but no one spoke. Tom continued, forcing himself to meet their eyes. "I've spent 2 weeks watching those videos. Not just from the park, but all the ones people posted afterward. Years of complaints, of incidents I justified to myself. I saw what I'd become, and He swallowed hard. "I don't like that person." Captain Richards leaned forward slightly. "What exactly are you asking for here, Bradley?" "A chance," Tom said simply. "Not to pretend this never happened. Not to go back to who I was. But a chance to learn how to do this right. To make amends, if that's even possible." The committee took 3 hours to deliberate. Tom waited in the hallway, watching other officers pass by. Some nodded to him now, the first acknowledgments he'd received since that day in the park. Maybe they'd heard about his voluntary enrollment in community policing courses, or the letters he'd written accepting full responsibility for his actions. When they called him back in, the decision was unexpected. A 6-month suspension without pay, mandatory counseling, and extensive retraining. But not termination. Not if he was serious about change. "The community has a voice in this," Richards explained. "We've spoken with local leaders, including some who've been critical of your past actions. They've agreed to be part of your rehabilitation process. Whether you keep your badge long-term will depend on their assessment of your progress." Tom nodded, understanding the weight of what they were offering. Not just a second chance, but a chance to rebuild himself from the ground up. The thought terrified him almost as much as it relieved him. The first community meeting was harder than any criminal confrontation he'd ever faced. He sat in the back of the community center, out of uniform, listening as people shared stories about their interactions with police. Some mentioned him specifically, the rigid officer who turned minor incidents into nightmares. A teenager described being afraid to skateboard in his own neighborhood. An elderly woman talked about rushing through her daily walk, worried about being questioned for resting too long on public benches. Each story carved away another piece of Tom's old certainties. He started volunteering at the community center, not as a police officer, but as just another person trying to help. At first, people kept their distance. Parents pulled their children closer when he walked by. But slowly, as days turned into weeks, something began to change. It started small. Tom noticed a broken basketball hoop in the center's playground and fixed it himself, working after hours when no one was around. The next day, he overheard kids talking about it, wondering who'd done the repair. He didn't say anything, but Mrs. Peterson from next door had seen him working. Word got around. He began attending neighborhood watch meetings, not to lecture about rules and regulations like he used to, but to listen. Really listen. He heard about the single mother who worked late shifts and worried about her teenage son walking home alone. The elderly couple afraid to report suspicious activity because they didn't trust the police response. Each story added another crack to his old worldview, but instead of trying to patch them, Tom let them break. Let the rigid structure of his former thinking crumble away. In its place, something new began to grow, an understanding that true authority came from trust, not fear. The hardest meeting was with Lily's family. His counselor had advised against it, saying it might be too soon, but Tom had insisted on trying. They met at a neutral location, a coffee shop chosen by their lawyer. Lily wasn't there. Her parents had firmly refused that part of his request, but her mother and father were. "I've rehearsed this 100 times, Tom began, his coffee untouched in front of him. Written letters, practice speeches. But sitting here now, he looked at these parents whose child he'd traumatized, saw the wariness in their eyes. "I'm sorry" doesn't begin to cover it. "Nothing I can say will undo what I did to your daughter." Lily's mother spoke first, her voice controlled but trembling. "Do you know she still has nightmares? That she doesn't want to play in the park anymore? That she asks us if she's a criminal?" Each question hit Tom like a physical blow, but he forced himself to listen, to really hear what his actions had done. "She was playing tag," her father added quietly. "Just playing tag." Tom nodded, feeling tears press against his eyes. "I know. I keep watching those videos, trying to understand who I was that day, who I'd become over all these years. The man who could put handcuffs on a child. I don't want to be him anymore." The meeting didn't end in forgiveness. That would take much longer, if it ever came. But as Tom left the coffee shop, Lily's mother had said something that gave him hope. "Show us," she'd told him. "Show us who you want to become instead."
So he did.
Day by day, interaction by interaction. He helped coach youth basketball at the community center, learning names, hearing stories, seeing each kid as an individual rather than a potential rule breaker. He attended cultural sensitivity training not just because it was required, but because he wanted to understand perspectives he dismissed for too long. His fellow officers watched his transformation with mixed reactions. Some remained skeptical, viewing his change as a performance to save his career. Others, like Mike Sullivan, began to reach out, sharing their own struggles with balancing authority and compassion. "You're not the only one who needed this wake-up call," Mike told him over coffee one morning. "We all get caught up in the power sometimes. The difference is you're actually doing something about it now." The neighborhood began to notice too. Small changes at first. People stopped crossing the street to avoid him. Then bigger ones, being invited to community events, asked for advice about local issues. Not as an authority figure, but as a neighbor who'd shown he could learn from his mistakes. 4 months into his suspension, Tom received an unexpected email. It was from the lawyer who'd recorded the incident in the park. He was organizing a community forum on police reform and wanted Tom to speak, not to defend his actions, but to share his journey toward understanding why they were wrong. Standing at the podium that evening, Looking out at faces that had once viewed him with fear and anger, Tom felt the last pieces of his old self finally fall away. "I used to think authority came from making people follow rules," he told them. "Now I understand it comes from helping people trust that the rules exist to protect them, not control them." In the back of the room, he spotted Captain Richards nodding slightly. Beside him sat Mrs. Peterson, the neighbor who'd stopped bringing him cookies years ago. She'd started again last week, leaving them on his porch with a note that said simply, "Welcome back to the neighborhood." The path to redemption wasn't straight or easy. Some days felt like moving backward, old habits trying to reassert themselves. But each time Tom caught himself slipping into rigid thinking, he remembered a yellow dress and tear-stained cheeks. Remembered the choice he'd made that day, and the choice he made every day since, to be someone different, someone better. The morning sun felt different on Tom's first day back in uniform. He stood in front of his mirror, adjusting the badge that now felt less like a shield and more like a reminder. 6 months had changed him in ways he couldn't have imagined that day in the park. His face looked softer somehow, the hard lines of authority replaced by something gentler. He'd earned the right to wear the uniform again, but not in the way he'd once thought. Each commendation in his review folder spoke of community engagement, of conflicts resolved without force, of trust being rebuilt one interaction at a time. The committee had voted unanimously for his reinstatement, but it was the letters from community members that meant the most. "Officer Bradley stopped to help my son fix his bike," one mother had written. "They talked for almost an hour. When I asked my son what they discussed, he said, 'Everything, Mom.' He actually listens now." Another letter came from the teenager he'd once threatened over skateboarding. "He helped us design a safe space to practice. Showed us how to write a proposal to the city council. He's different now." His first shift back started where everything had changed: the park. Tom parked his cruiser and walked the familiar paths, nodding to the morning regulars. Some smiled back now, no longer hurrying away at his approach. The maintenance area where Lily had stepped that day was long repaired, the yellow tape and signs gone. In their place, children played freely, their laughter no longer a source of irritation but a reminder of why he'd chosen this job in the first place. Jimmy from the newsstand waved as Tom passed. "Welcome back, Officer Bradley." His display still extended slightly onto the sidewalk, but now Tom saw it differently, saw the man trying to make a living, the small business adding character to their neighborhood. He stopped to buy a paper, asking about Jimmy's daughter, who'd just started college. The morning brought its share of incidents. It always did in a city this size. A group of teenagers were playing music too loud near the convenience store. 6 months ago, Tom would have swooped in with citations ready. Now he walked over casually, recognizing some faces from the community center basketball games. "Hey, Marcus," he called to one boy. "How's that jump shot coming along?" The music volume dropped without him having to say a word. They talked about the upcoming tournament, about Marcus's chances at a sports scholarship. When Tom left, the music stayed at a reasonable level, not because of fear or authority, but because of respect freely given and received. A call came in about a disturbance at Linda's diner. Tom found himself smiling as he walked in, remembering how she'd once tensed at his approach. Today she greeted him warmly, explaining the situation: a customer refusing to pay, claiming his eggs were overcooked. "Sir," Tom addressed the angry man, pulling up a chair instead of standing over him. "Let's talk about what's really going on here." 20 minutes later, the bill was paid. Linda had offered a fresh breakfast on the house, and the man had shared his story about losing his job, about how this small act of defiance had been born of deeper frustrations. The biggest test came that afternoon. A call about kids playing too close to a construction site, eerily similar to that day with Lily. Tom's heart beat faster as he approached, but he was a different person now. He found 3 children peering through the fence at the heavy machinery. "Pretty cool equipment, right?" he said, crouching down to their level. They jumped, but didn't run. One boy nodded enthusiastically. "You know, I bet the site manager would give you a proper tour if we asked. But we'd need your parents' permission, and you'd have to wear safety gear. What do you think?" Their faces lit up. Within an hour, Tom had arranged a supervised visit for the weekend, complete with hard hats and a lesson about construction safety. The kids left excited about learning rather than scared of punishment, and the construction crew gained enthusiastic allies in keeping other children away from the dangerous areas. As the shift continued, Tom noticed things he'd missed in his old, rigid mindset. The elderly woman who always sat too long on the bench? She needed that rest because of her arthritis, and now she shared stories about the neighborhood's history when he stopped to chat. The jaywalking teenagers? They crossed there because the nearest crosswalk was broken. Tom put in a repair request and suggested a temporary crossing guard until it was fixed. Late afternoon brought him back to the park. A flash of yellow caught his eye, a little girl in a dress, playing with friends. His chest tightened for a moment, memories threatening to overwhelm him. But this was a different day, a different child, a different Tom Bradley. He watched them play from a distance, not as an enforcer looking for violations, but as a protector ensuring their safety. When a ball rolled his way, he picked it up and tossed it back, earning happy waves from the children. None of them ran away. None of them looked scared. The sun was setting when Tom got a call he never expected. Lily's mother, asking if he would attend a community safety meeting at her daughter's school. The kids need to see what positive change looks like, she said. They need to know that people can learn and grow. Driving home that evening, Tom passed all his old patrol spots. The skateboard park he'd helped establish in that empty lot. The community garden that had replaced a frequent trouble spot. The youth center, where he now volunteered on weekends. Each place marked a step in his journey from rigid enforcer to trusted guardian. His neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, was watering her flowers as he pulled into his driveway. "Good first day back," she called. When he nodded, she smiled. "We can tell, you know. The whole neighborhood can tell. You're not just wearing the badge anymore, you're wearing it right." That night, Tom sat in his living room, looking at the same photos that had haunted him 6 months ago. His father in uniform, himself as a rookie, all those commendations on the wall. But now he saw them differently. The badge hadn't changed, he had. Every day brought new opportunities to prove it, to show that authority could be gentle without being weak, firm without being rigid. His phone buzzed with a message from Captain Richards. "Heard good things about your first day back. Keep it up." Another text followed from Mike Sullivan, asking if he'd mentor some rookies about community policing. The requests didn't feel like burdens anymore, but opportunities to pass on the hard lessons he'd learned. As night fell over the city he'd sworn to protect and serve, Tom Bradley finally understood what those words truly meant. Protection didn't always need handcuffs and citations. Service wasn't about enforcing every rule blindly. Sometimes it meant seeing the person before the violation, understanding before acting, listening before judging. The badge on his chest caught the last light of day, no longer a shield to hide behind, but a symbol of the trust he worked to rebuild every day. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose between the old way and the new. But Tom wasn't afraid anymore. He'd learned that true strength lay not in rigid authority, but in the courage to admit mistakes and the wisdom to learn from them. In the end, it took a child in a yellow dress to teach a veteran officer the most important lesson of his career, that the law without compassion was just another form of violence, and that real justice began with understanding the human heart.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.